I wanted to speak today about kind of some of the things that we're seeing working with the clients in the kind of applied AI. Yeah, that's next. I'm Tim Deeson, one of the co-founders of Greenshoot Labs. We enable transformation through applied AI and conversational interfaces, and what we're seeing with that, I guess, is that it's kind of a complicated space. There's those kind of words, AI and kind of conversational interfaces, get kind of bandied around quite a lot. We find the kind of the clients that we work with often have a kind of a fairly weak understanding of the kind of nuance of what some of these kind of terminology mean. And my background, it's interesting for me kind of seeing conversational interfaces and applied AI as a marketplace and as a kind of a set of services. So I first started a web agency, so a kind of digital agency in 2001, and around that time I was seeing kind of many of the same kind of confusion and kind of questions, I guess, amongst clients of when they were first starting to adopt websites. So why would they have a website? What could it do for them? What were the kind of prerequisites for a project that they would need to make it successful? And it's really interesting seeing kind of some of those trends and some of those misunderstandings around what's possible with automation and conversational interfaces and applied AI now. And so kind of recently, Greenshoot Labs, which is the kind of focuses on conversational interfaces and applied AI, was acquired along with Deeson, and I'm now working on kind of a growth plan for Greenshoot Labs, which is kind of specialising in this space. And just kind of, I guess, in summary, so talking about what we see kind of within enterprise automation and AI, what I think is often quite misunderstood about what is a chatbot, what isn't a chatbot, why does it matter, how do we define these things, the relationship between AI and chatbots, like are they synonymous, what kind of techniques within AI do we use to power chatbots, and do you have chatbots that actually don't need and are better off without some of the kind of artificial intelligence techniques that we see. And it's kind of interesting also for me to kind of get feedback. We have a framework that we're starting to use with clients to say, to help them understand what kind of chatbot might be relevant to their circumstances, what the kind of features or benefits they might need from a chatbot. And also, for me, we've been working in open source. I've been working in open source since kind of 2001, and for me it was always really important to some of the principles around open source and some of the kind of founding principles, I guess, of the internet. And I think the kind of tech giants and commercialization have now made some of that kind of more complicated. There are kind of big movements within AI that are powered by open source, but there's also, to me, a bit of a kind of a threat, I guess, in some ways around privacy or licensing or intellectual property, or even the kind of how the talent kind of gets accrued in amongst kind of relatively few very powerful companies, and some of the kind of trends that we see around that. So just a quick kind of lightweight agenda that we'll run through. So, you know, for me, my co-founder, he has a PhD in AI, so I kind of constantly have interesting conversations and kind of learn more and more about what really is the kind of some of the nuance around AI, and what does it particularly mean if you're building solutions for people. So not if you're an academic, not if you're kind of a scientist, what does it actually mean when we talk to kind of business people who want to use artificial intelligence to solve business problems. And kind of Ronald, my co-founder, we kind of break this apart into these kind of areas where you have techniques of things like machine learning, knowledge modeling, reasoning and planning, but they're really kind of low-level building blocks in some ways, in the same way as kind of relational databases or structured query language. Like, they're not tools that you use to solve business problems at a high level. What they do is they actually create capabilities, and capabilities is something where I think we start to get kind of more familiar with artificial intelligence. So it starts to be able to create the senses maybe that we would associate with living beings, I guess. So the vision and the ability to interpret vision, speech processing, so the ability to hear audio and actually turn it into language and meaning, natural language processing and generation, so the ability to create speech or to interpret written speech, and robotics, so the ability to create movement and kind of interpretation of an environment, for example. And really, it's kind of at the application end of things where I think is the kind of the level that really matters from an organisational point of view. Because again, in the capability sense, they really are just capabilities. They're not necessarily, they don't create business value intrinsically. They're kind of a toolbox of things that you might use. And they, for me, they start to enable things like virtual assistants and chatbots. So using things like natural language processing, for example, you can start to interpret what someone says or speak back to them. Process automation, so you might be using machine learning to predict failure rates or predict something that you can augment kind of a human within that, and the same with expert systems, and certainly kind of autonomous machines, where we start to see the ability for robots and things to move around and interpret an environment. And something that we kind of keep picking apart kind of again and again in some ways is what's really, what kind of AI, if any AI, is kind of relevant to a project, what kind of chatbots and what kind of conversational interfaces are relevant, and from a client point of view, kind of what's the project, like what really does success look like? And we would always try and start with a business problem there, where in some cases, which, you know, it is always an interesting conversation where someone kind of says, well, we need to commission an AI project, and Ronald, certainly the co-founder, would kind of try and stop himself rolling his eyes and go, you really don't want kind of an AI project, that's a complicated and meaningless thing. Looking at kind of chatbots specifically in the kind of the Gartner technology kind of adoption hype life cycle, you know, back in 2016, bots were the kind of the big new thing. The CEO of Microsoft was saying, you know, this is going to replace apps as the last kind of wave of things that were going to kill everything and replace everything. And I guess we started to kind of certainly see the kind of the hype and the kind of cycle of those go through. So we kind of fast forward to last year, and again the messaging was actually, you know, this isn't going to kind of deliver any of the promises that we thought it would. They're going to be dead. This was a waste of time. Kind of move on to the next thing. And it's really interesting to kind of understand that kind of Gartner technology adoption life cycle, because it really, you can really see lots of different technologies kind of go through that cycle. And I think things like Google Assistant are a great example of there's actually a maturity thing. The technology and the understanding of user interface and user experience has got much more sophisticated, and you start to see some really kind of compelling use cases for that. And in 2019, you know, I think we are seeing some really kind of compelling, impactful adoption of these. Are just, you know, powerful things that we should be doing and do. And certainly kind of a favourite project of mine is LubeChat, which I think was at the last meetup. So Shell have, I think, something like 40,000 industrial lubricants, and they've created this, what I think is as far as chatbot projects go, it's a really cool project that they've created to kind of help their customers understand which of the lubricant products that they hold might be relevant, the safety information, the training information, etc., etc. And within the consumer space, again, you're starting to see you know, very sticky platforms like Facebook Messenger have quite powerful e-commerce and payment functionality within them. So there's kind of really compelling reasons for retailers to want to adopt this from a conversion or kind of competitive perspective. And, you know, going back to Gartner, you know, I think you always have to take these kind of industry analysts with a pinch of salt, but they're looking something like kind of 25% of companies will deploy a chatbot by 2020. Like certainly some of the conversations we have these days, people are confident that they're going to implement a project, and they're kind of getting into some of the details of that. This is kind of an interesting definition, which I'm not going to read to you word for word, but I think it starts to kind of speak about actually how much misunderstanding and how much confusion there is around the terminology, and some of the kind of efforts to define what is conversational AI, conversational interfaces, chatbots, talkbots. You know, there's a lot of terminology, and I don't think it's very precise. And a definition that we've been kind of working on is there's kind of two things happening within chatbots. There's kind of an interaction paradigm that uses conversational interfaces, so the exchange of messages between a user and a bot. So that's the interaction paradigm is what's actually happening here. And beneath that, you've also got how do you create the software, the platform that actually kind of enables that interaction paradigm. So you've got a conversational interface, and you've got some software that actually powers that. And that for us is the kind of, it starts to get into kind of useful definition territory. And we see kind of lots of different, you know, a conversation can actually mean lots of different things, and you know, from the highly kind of structured to the open-ended. So the more open-ended the conversation, we certainly see that the kind of the need to depend on AI techniques to understand intent becomes kind of higher and higher. So you can have highly structured chatbots that you really don't need to. You could have built them 30 years ago using kind of decision trees, and you start to see some of the kind of the more the complex and kind of open-ended interactions use some of the kind of the latest and greatest kind of emerging technologies. And occasionally we'll have a kind of what's a real chatbot kind of conversation. This is probably me quoting Ronald, the co-founder, word for word, as someone who spent kind of a long time in academia studying kind of artificial intelligence, and he would really say it doesn't really matter. Like chatbots are, it's the definition that I kind of just gave really there. That this is what kind of matters when we're talking about chatbots. Some of the what kind of part of AI is being used. What really matters is good chatbots make users happy. Good chatbot makes users happy, and they solve problems. The rest of it is kind of detail. An example, kind of a structured kind of interaction would be the kind of classic kind of button pushing chatbot. It lets you know what's possible. It lets you instantly kind of make a decision. It lets you see if it's kind of available the what you'd want to deliver, and you kind of can quickly kind of move through a flow. The open-ended kind of option of that, which would be much more, sometimes it's praised as a kind of positively human kind of interaction, but the problem is you don't know the limitations of the technology or the chatbot that you're interacting with, and so you're kind of straight into the natural language processing aspects of this, where there's a message been sent, and you're then kind of into natural text back and forth. And you've obviously got the pros and cons there of, do you want to type kind of long-form text messages to a piece of software back and forth? Depends again on your use case. And just reinforcing that point, I guess, that it's the kind of the right activity at the right time in the right medium. Like, I personally don't think there's a kind of a good or bad. Is it better to press buttons in an interaction with a conversational interface? Is it better to type long-form text? What's really important is that you're solving the user need in the most efficient way. The kind of the user interface and the kind of technology that you use to understand and solve that problem really, really doesn't matter. And you can then start to kind of model, what's an open-ended versus a structured interaction, what's very task-orientated. So you have kind of chatbots that are really designed to create a social, open, interactive kind of experience. And maybe that's for entertainment, and actually you don't really mind exactly where the conversation goes or what succeeds or what fails. Back to things like LeadBot by Drift, which is designed to solve a very specific problem of collect information about leads. And it's really not very customizable or kind of fluid, I guess. And this is where we kind of start to look at the kind of a structured analysis. So looking across some of these dimensions, is it important that it can deal with a single task incredibly effectively, or is it kind of a set of task platform? Is it a task platform that would allow you to kind of solve many things? How many platforms can it work across, for example? Is it, if it's on SMS, then it maybe need to be super simple and super kind of back and forth interactions? And also, is there autonomous improvement? Is it learning and adapting and evolving? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? If it was a medical diagnosis and a recommendation platform, you may not want it to be kind of autonomously making decisions about how it could serve patients better, because you may be under a significant amount of regulation and testing to ensure that it isn't kind of creatively coming up with new diagnoses for diseases on the fly. And that, using this kind of model, you would then start to be able to say, well, what kind of methodology should we use for the project, what kind of team, what kind of tooling. You can then start to have some kind of a good understanding of the kind of facets and attributes that you could define your project with. And looking at kind of a couple of projects, kind of real world examples, I guess, of like how would you use to kind of evaluate or understand them using that kind of method. So something we built was for a charity around kind of giving free 24/7 support to victims of cybercrime. So cybercrime experts are super expensive; they're not available to kind of people at home necessarily, and you can see for that kind of use case, you can put kind of a long form description of the attack that you've had, and it will come back with a diagnosis and recommendation for the action that you can take. And you can start to see, well, what kind of attributes were important in that chatbot versus not. So they wanted ongoing diagnostics and to be curated, so it will understand how the attacks are performing and allow them to tune it, but they wanted that to be a manual thing. They don't want it to automatically be making decisions about how it could have adjusted itself effectively. Looking at it again in a kind of a much more structured sense, so we built an audit platform for an accountancy firm in Switzerland actually. So privacy on premise is really important. Swiss law is very, very clear about financial information leaving the borders. It's not something they're kind of big fans of. And you can see here, you start to kind of have a different model of very structured user input, but kind of open-ended interaction to allow people to kind of understand more about how, have kind of open questions about their audit, I guess. So some of the information in an audit is very structured, and other parts of the information they want you to be able to ask kind of questions about. And for them, it's on a proprietary internal platform, so it's only on web chat. They don't want people to be able to reach out to them on Facebook Messenger, for example. And that kind of gives you kind of a structure, I guess, effectively, and it's something that I'm always really interested to talk about and get kind of more feedback about, because it's very much a kind of work in progress to say, how do we kind of have terminology about things like chatbots and artificial intelligence, but how do we kind of demystify and kind of provide some better insight and some ways to have kind of more meaningful conversations with some of that terminology. So, why, as I said, back in kind of 2001 and seeing the kind of emergence of adoption of web kind of in a stronger and stronger way, for me, the ability for there to be a kind of a healthy ecosystem for open source is really, really important. It's about the kind of freedom of use cases, the freedom of intellectual property, the fact that kind of the control and use of these platforms isn't aggregated maybe only with companies who have kind of commercial goals, because there may be problems and use cases that people want to solve that maybe don't have a direct financial benefit or a medium-term kind of financial benefit. We created an Open Dialogue, which is an open source conversation management platform, and it deliberately integrates with a kind of best-of-breed range of intent mapping and natural language processing platforms. So it uses things like RASA and Spacey, which are kind of natural language processing and intent mapping, kind of completely open source, completely flexible frameworks, as well as things like Dialogflow and Google Cloud. So depending on your use case and your scenario, where maybe privacy or licensing or scalability and cost are really important, it was a really kind of key issue for us to build something that meant that it kind of there was that option to kind of evolve and change the kind of approach that you would take. It wasn't locked into this closed ecosystem where pricing or licensing could kind of suddenly mean that what you'd built wasn't going to exist anymore. Yeah, and that's me. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Anyone? Yeah, go ahead. For the travel and hospitality industry, do you think chatbots are a good medium to have a conversation with the guests? Have you seen any good examples in this industry?
Yeah, so there's a hotel chain that have used them to provide that kind of in-room concierge service in a more scalable way, so to provide that kind of in-room personal assistant. And there was a study, maybe it was on e-consultancy, I think, that was looking at it was really about increasing conversion through the booking sites, had been the main kind of the killer reason. So if you're faced with that kind of classic problem of you're on a villa booking site and there's 4,000 villas and they basically all look the same, and you're not sure which villa to choose or how to pick a villa, being able to provide a kind of a guide by a kind of question and answer process of saying, do you want it to be in a town centre, or do you want it to be near mountains? Would you like to be near the beach? Do you need to have a pool? How many bedrooms do you need? So providing a way of selecting the right option for you from a kind of complex data set. That was something that I'd see. I've had a few kind of conversations with people who've worked in the industry who said that seemed to be kind of one of the stronger use cases, so more on the booking and conversion end. I know there's been some experiments with voice being used in hotel rooms, and the placement of things like Alexas, and to kind of provide that kind of better in-room kind of hotel experience, but it's not, neither of them an area that we've kind of worked in. It's just something that I've kind of heard discussed.
Anyone else?
Can you tell us or show us a little bit more about Open Dialogue, please?
Of course.
So was that like the most softball question of all time? No, make it a little harder. Like, can you actually show us like what it looks like? Why would we use this over coding it ourselves?
Yes, very good question. So Open dialogue kind of solves a few different problems. You could think of it in some ways as a kind of equivalent to something like Microsoft bot framework. It's a framework that's designed to connect together things like SMS, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Slack. So you have all of those different channels where you might want to have a conversation, and you also have some of these platforms which may be doing your natural language processing and your intent mapping. And Open Dialogue is designed to take out some of the kind of the repetitive heavy lifting where you don't want to be kind of building all of these glue layers between these frameworks all the time, and you want to have a set of principles and concepts to design conversations, model conversations, manage the content for conversations in a way that allows maybe content to be delegated to a content team and separate out the kind of conversational design from the content storage. So in some ways you could think of it as kind of a content management system or a content management framework that we would think of in kind of a web world. It does some of the jobs of gluing things together and kind of easing the kind of the maintenance and creation jobs, both for a developer and for a content team or a management team. The same for things like analytics, kind of lots of the jobs that you kind of start to come across when you start to build these systems at scale.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? That's it.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.